They bound her hands in front of the church. The crowd gathered not with mercy, but with hunger in their eyes. A girl, barely 19, forced to face judgment she did not deserve. The preacher raised his hand, and the whip cracked like thunder, slicing through the evening air. She did not scream. She would not give them the sound of her pain. Blood ran, tears burned, yet her chin stayed high. The townsfolk whispered that this was justice, but deep down, they knew it was cruelty dressed in holy robes. And then, in the silence between lashes, he stepped forward, a stranger, a cowboy no one knew. He said nothing, yet his silence shook the ground more than the preacher's voice ever had. He stopped the whip midair, and in one single moment, the world held its breath. Who was this man? Why did he choose her? And what final step would he take that would leave the whole town trembling forever? This is not just a story of pain. It is a story of defiance, of silence that speaks louder than screams, and of a single step that changed everything. The sun sank low over the prairie town of Dusthaven, turning the wooden crosses on the church steeple into long shadows stretching across the dirt street. People gathered there, their voices hushed, their eyes sharp, waiting for what they claimed was justice, but what smelled more like cruelty. At the center of it all stood a girl, her wrists bound to a post in front of the church. Her name was Eliza, barely 19, fragile yet proud. Her torn dress flapped in the evening wind, and though her face was pale, her eyes refused to bow. The townsfolk had named her a sinner, though the truth of her crime mattered little. Rumors had been enough. A girl, too poor, too alone, and too outspoken, had become the perfect scapegoat. And so tonight, they demanded a whipping, a public spectacle, in the name of righteousness. The church bells tolled, each strike echoing like a hammer on her chest. The preacher, tall and cold, raised his hand to silence the whispers. The wages of sin must be answered, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but no one looked at Eliza's trembling hands. No one saw the tear slipping down her cheek. They wanted a punishment, not a person. The man chosen to wield the whip stepped forward. His boots crunched on the gravel. His hand gripped the leather coil. He was no stranger to violence. His lips curled into a cruel smile as he prepared. The crowd pressed closer, mothers clutching children, men narrowing their eyes, eager for the strike to fall. Eliza lifted her chin. She would not beg, she would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. Somewhere inside, she clung to the whisper of her late mother's words. Hold your dignity, even when the world strips everything else. The first lash cracked through the air like thunder. It tore into her back, and though the pain burned hot, she clenched her teeth and made no sound. Gasps rose, but not of pity, only hunger for more. The second lash followed, crueler than the first, her body jerking against the ropes. She winced, her lips trembling, but still, no cry escaped her. By the third strike, blood seeped through her dress. Her knees threatened to give way, yet her eyes stayed fierce, burning against the fire of humiliation. Among the crowd, unnoticed, leaned a man against the shadow of a stable post. A cowboy, tall, weather-worn, dust on his hat, silence in his eyes. He hadn't spoken a word since he rode into town that morning. Some said they'd seen him drift from place to place, never staying, never explaining. His silence wasn't empty, was depth, like a river too deep to see the bottom. Now, his gaze fixed on Eliza, not like the others, not with judgment or hunger. His eyes carried something heavier, recognition, sorrow, a quiet storm no one else could feel. The fourth lash fell, and Eliza swayed. Her strength was fading, her breath ragged, her vision blurring under the jeers of the crowd. Confess, someone shouted. Admit your shame, cried another. But she only closed her eyes, whispering in her heart the prayer no one else would hear. That's when the cowboy's hand shifted. His boot pressed against the dirt, a subtle movement, but it carried the weight of thunder. He stepped forward from the shadows. The crowd did not notice at first, their eyes glued to Eliza's suffering. The fifth lash cut through the air, but before it could land, a hand gripped the whip. The leather froze midair. Silence fell. Gasps echoed. The cowboy stood there, silent still, holding the arm of the man who delivered the blows. His jaw was clenched, his eyes cold fire. Let go, the man hissed, yanking, but the cowboy didn't move, didn't speak. His silence was louder than any word. The crowd shifted, confusion turning to whispers. Who was he? Why interfere? The preacher scowled. stepping down from the church steps. "Stranger," he spat, "this is the Lord's justice. Release the man." Still, the cowboy said nothing. His hand remained, steady as stone, on the whip. He turned his gaze briefly to Eliza, broken, bleeding, but still proud, and in that look, something passed between them. Not words, not questions, but recognition. He had known this pain too. The crowd grew restless. Murmurs of defiance, shouts of warning. "He's defying the church." Someone cried, "Throw him out." But the cowboy released the whip and instead stepped closer to Eliza. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though he had already decided what must be done. He reached the post, his calloused hands untying the ropes that held her. Gasps broke out louder now, scandal rising in their voices. "Stop him. She deserves this. He has no right." But still, no one dared step closer. Eliza stumbled as the ropes fell away, nearly collapsing. For the first time since the punishment began, she allowed herself to fall not into the dirt, but into the arms of the silent cowboy. He caught her, with gentleness that contradicted the storm brewing in his eyes. He said nothing, yet his embrace spoke louder than sermons, louder than lashes. The girl who had stood alone against the cruelty of a town now found herself shielded, without words, by a man who carried silence like a weapon. The preacher's face turned red with fury. "This is rebellion," he thundered. "You cannot protect sin." But the cowboy's only answer was stillness. His silence was defiance. His silence was judgment, and upon the girl, but upon them all. The crowd shifted, unease replacing certainty. For the first time, they looked not at Eliza but at themselves, and the reflection in the cowboy's unspoken stare unsettled them. Eliza's tears finally fell, not from the pain of lashes, but from the sudden weight of mercy. She pressed her face against the rough fabric of his coat, trembling. She did not know his name. She did not know why he came. But she knew this. In that moment, he had stood between her and a world that wanted to break her. And though the night had not yet ended, though danger still lingered in the preacher's wrath and the crowd's unrest, something irreversible had begun. A silent cowboy had taken a single step, and the course of everything in Dusthaven would never be the same again. The crowd stood frozen, eyes darting between the girl in the cowboy's arms and the preacher fuming on the church steps. The silence was heavier than stone, broken only by Eliza's soft, ragged breaths against his chest. The cowboy had spoken no words, yet his defiance rang louder than any sermon the preacher had thundered in years. Dusthaven had never seen a man like him. "Seize him," the preacher barked, his voice shaking with fury. A few men lurched forward, driven by loyalty to their so-called justice. But when the cowboy turned his head toward them, his silence was a blade. His eyes, cold as steel, stripped away their bravado. One by one, they faltered. No one wanted to be the first to test him. The preacher's fists clenched. He is an intruder, a blasphemer. He dares stand against the house of God. His words clawed at the crowd, trying to reignite their rage, but doubts had already crept into their hearts. They remembered the sight of the whip raised high, and the way the cowboy's hand had stopped it midair. They remembered Eliza's blood, the tears she had refused to shed, and now, for the first time, they wondered if the real sin was theirs. The cowboy shifted his hold on Eliza, lifting her to her feet, though she could barely stand. Her knees buckled, but his arms steadied her like iron. He glanced at the crowd, then back at the preacher. Still, no words, only silence. But it was enough. That silence carried a message clearer than any speech. Your cruelty ends here. Step by step, he led her away from the church. The people parted like waves before him, their eyes wide, their voices trapped in their throats. Eliza's head swam, each step in agony, yet the warmth of his arm steadied her heart. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faint flicker of hope. They passed the blacksmith, who had once spat at her feet, the baker's wife, who had whispered lies behind her back. None dared lift their gaze as she walked past, her blood-stained dress trailing behind. Every eye lowered, every tongue stilled, as though the silent cowboy's presence had become a mirror, showing them the ugliness of their own faces. At the edge of town, beneath the dim glow of lantern light, the cowboy stopped. He turned, scanning the crowd one last time. The preacher had followed, red-faced, his voice shrill with venom. You cannot save her. She is stained. She is cursed. Mark my words, stranger, you've only taken sin into your arms. For the first time, The cowboy spoke. His voice was low, rough as gravel, yet steady enough to still the night. "No," he said, "just one word," but it struck the crowd harder than any sermon, harder than any whip. The preacher froze. The crowd inhaled sharply. That one word shattered the spell of fear they had lived under for years. Eliza turned her head to look up at him. Tears filled her eyes, not from pain but from the realization that he had finally broken his silence for her. The preacher stumbled back, words dying on his lips. The cowboy turned again, leading Eliza beyond the last wooden fences of Dust Haven, into the open plains where stars stretched endlessly overhead. The town shrank behind them, its noise replaced by the hush of night. Only when the church bell finally stopped ringing did Eliza whisper, her voice trembling, "Why? Why would you risk everything for me?" The cowboy didn't answer right away. He helped her to a fallen log, tore a strip from his own shirt, and pressed it gently against the wounds on her back. His hands were rough, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. He looked into her eyes, and at last he spoke again, because once, he said slowly, no one stopped them. For me. Her breath caught. In his silence, she had sensed a shadow, a sorrow older than his years. Now, his words painted it clear. Somewhere, sometime, he too had stood where she stood, bound, broken, whipped by the so-called righteous, and no one had come. No hand had stopped the lash. No arms had caught him when he fell. His silence was not emptiness. It was the memory of screams that had gone unanswered. Eliza's tears fell freely now, not from weakness but from recognition. He had carried his pain in silence all these years, until tonight, when her suffering had drawn it back to the surface. But instead of letting it chain him, he had turned it into strength. The night grew colder, but she no longer shivered. The cowboy sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the first trace of dawn began to glow. She leaned against him, her fragile frame finding shelter in his presence. For a long time, neither spoke. They didn't need words. His silence, once a burden, had become a sanctuary. Back in Dust Haven, the preacher raged, but something had shifted in the town. The people no longer looked at him with blind obedience. They whispered among themselves about the stranger who had stood silent and unyielding, who had stopped a whip with his bare hand. His one word no echoed in their minds. The church's grip had cracked, and though the preacher tried to mend it, he knew the stranger had left a scar he could not heal. As dawn broke, painting the plains gold, Eliza found herself staring at the cowboy's profile. Strong, weathered, scarred by years of hardship, yet softened now by the light. She wanted to thank him, to speak the flood of words in her chest, but he placed a finger gently to her lips, shaking his head. No words were needed. His silence was enough. And in that silence, Eliza understood. Sometimes the loudest defiance isn't shouted from pulpits or written in decrees. Sometimes it's a single step taken in the face of cruelty. Sometimes it's one man holding a broken girl without a single word. That was the cowboy's final step. Not just across the churchyard, not just into the crowd's judgment, but into her life, into her story, rewriting it forever. And though Dust Haven would speak of that night for generations, for Eliza, it was simple. She had been whipped before the church, abandoned by all. But then, in her darkest hour, a silent cowboy had held her without words, and that silence had changed everything. The road stretched endlessly before them, the morning sun rising like a promise over the plains. Eliza walked with slow steps, her body weak but her spirit steadied by the man beside her. Each time she faltered, his hand was there, silent, firm, unshakable. For years she had known only rejection, whispers, and blame. But now, for the first time, she felt seen not as a sinner, not as a burden, but as a soul worth saving. The cowboy said little. His silence wasn't cold, it was shelter. Where others had spoken words of judgment, his silence carried understanding deeper than speech. She felt it each time his shadow fell across hers, each time his steady gaze swept the horizon, watching, protecting. It was as though his silence told her, "You're safe now, you're not alone." When they reached a ridge, he paused. Below lay a wide valley, untamed and alive. The grass shimmered in the wind, the river cut a silver path, and beyond, the mountains stood proud against the sky. Eliza stopped, her breath catching. She had never seen anything so vast, so free. She turned to him, searching his weathered face. "Why bring me here?" she whispered. For a long time he said nothing. Then, Finally, his rough voice broke the hush. "Because here," he murmured, "no one can bind you. No one can strike you here. You begin again." Her chest tightened. Those words, so simple, carried the weight of salvation. She looked out over the valley, and in that moment, she saw not just land, but a future, a place where her scars could heal, where her voice could rise again, where she could live without fear. The cowboy studied her face, and for the first time, a flicker of a smile tugged at his lips. It was faint, almost hidden, but it carried more comfort than any sermon she had ever heard. She knew then that this man, silent and scarred, had given her more than protection. He had given her hope, that the memory of the churchyard still lingered in her mind. The whip, the jeers, the preacher's fury. But as the wind brushed her hair, and the cowboy's presence steadied her heart, those memories began to fade. What remained was the moment he had stepped forward, the moment silence had shattered cruelty. Eliza lowered herself to the grass, her body trembling from exhaustion. The cowboy knelt beside her, his hat shadowing his eyes. She reached for his hand, hesitant, then held it tight. For the first time since her mother's passing, she felt the warmth of belonging. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You saved me." He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his tone low and steady. "You saved yourself. I just stood where no one else would." Tears filled her eyes, spilling freely. The words sank into her soul, like seeds planted in broken soil. She had stood, she had endured, and though the world had tried to break her, she had not bent. And because of him, because of that single silent step, her life was no longer defined by pain. The sky grew brighter, the valley opening before them like a book waiting to be written. Eliza leaned against him, closing her eyes, allowing herself, at last, to rest. The cowboy sat still, his arm around her shoulders, his silence stronger than any vow. He didn't need words, his presence was enough. Back in Dust Haven, the preacher's voice echoed hollow against empty pews. The townsfolk avoided his eyes, haunted by the memory of what they had allowed. They remembered the girl's blood, the stranger's silence, and the one word that had undone them all. No matter how the preacher thundered, the seed of doubt had been planted, and his grip on their souls would never again be whole. But for Eliza, none of that mattered anymore. The church, the lashes, the GRS, they were behind her now. Ahead was freedom, carved not by sermons or laws, but by the quiet courage of a man who chose to act when no one else dared. The silent cowboy had taken his final step, not into the churchyard, not into the crowd, but into her life, and that step had changed everything. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps us share more stories that move the soul. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that will make you feel, think, and hope. Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear how this story made you feel. Thank you for watching, for believing in the power of courage, hope, and silent heroes. Your support means the world to us.